She gave her treasured wedding ring to her daughter-in-law as a symbol of trust, but received a broom in return. Now with tears in her eyes, she's selling the family home. This story will make you reflect deeply. The morning light filtered through lace curtains in the modest Chicago bungalow, casting shadows across the empty kitchen table, where Dorothy sat with trembling hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Mother's Day had passed like a ghost through her home. No phone calls, no cards, no gentle knock at her door, just silence that pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked relentlessly, each second marking another moment of abandonment that settled deep into her bones. At 73, Dorothy had learned to measure love not in grand gestures, but in small remembrances. A Sunday visit, a shared meal, a voice on the telephone asking how she felt. But yesterday, even those modest hopes had withered like flowers left too long without water. She stared at the framed photograph on the windowsill, her late husband Robert's smiling face beside her own, both of them young and radiant on their wedding day in 1952. The gold band with tiny embedded diamonds that once graced her finger had been passed down through 3 generations of Murphy women, each one believing in the sacred trust of family. The front door's sudden creak shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. Patricia, her daughter-in-law of 15 years, swept into the kitchen without removing her designer coat, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum with the authority of someone who owned the space she occupied. Without a word of greeting, she dropped 2 objects onto the scratched counter with deliberate carelessness. A stained dog-eared cookbook with pages falling from its binding, and a cheap plastic broom still wrapped in crinkled cellophane. "Happy belated Mother's Day, Patricia," announced with a smile that never reached her eyes, each word dripping with manufactured sweetness that curdled in the air between them. "Since you're retired now, I thought you could use more time to perfect your cooking. And this broom, well, it seemed to match your practical style." The pause before practical hung heavy with unspoken judgment, transforming what should have been kindness into cruelty wrapped in politeness. Dorothy's weathered hands, which had once cradled newborns and kneaded bread and sewn Halloween costumes late into the night, now trembled as she stared at the insulting gifts. This was the woman to whom she had entrusted her most precious possession, a wedding ring that had symbolized love, commitment, and the continuity of generations. She had slipped it from her own finger with tears of joy, believing she was welcoming a daughter into their family's sacred circle. Now facing the cookbook and broom, she understood how profoundly she had miscalculated the worth of her gesture. That evening, Dorothy sat in her faded armchair, scrolling through social media on the tablet her grandson had taught her to use. Her heart contracted painfully when Patricia's post appeared on her screen, a gleaming photograph of Patricia embracing her own mother beside an elegant blue velvet jewelry box from Tiffany & Co. The caption read, "To the woman who raised me like royalty, happy. Mother's Day to my queen." The image had dozens of likes and heart-shaped comments, each one a small knife twisting in Dorothy's chest. She stared at that blue box for a long time, not coveting its contents but aching for what it represented. The recognition that a mother's love deserved honor, not mockery. A week later, Patricia returned with tears that seemed rehearsed, her voice pitched to the exact frequency of false remorse. "It was just a silly joke, Dorothy," she said, though her arms remained crossed defensively across her chest. "You know how you get sometimes, so sensitive about everything. I didn't mean anything by it." But her eyes darted away as she spoke, unable to maintain the fiction of sincerity when confronted by Dorothy's steady gaze. Dorothy rose slowly from her kitchen chair, the legs scraping against tile that had witnessed decades of family meals and midnight conversations. "Is that what I've become to you, Patricia, a joke?" Her voice carried the weight of accumulated hurts, each one a thread in the tapestry of her diminishing worth in this house that had once been filled with laughter and belonging. Patricia's mask slipped, completely revealing the impatience that had always lurked beneath her social graces. "Why do you always have to compare yourself to other people? You're not poor, you're not starving. If jewelry matters so much to you, buy your own." The Words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through Dorothy's consciousness with startling clarity. I wasn't asking for gold, Patricia. I was asking to be seen. Dorothy's voice grew stronger with each word, decades of silence finally breaking like a dam. You married my son, and I gave you the ring from my own finger. My grandmother's ring, my mother's ring, my ring. I cooked Sunday dinners for your family. I watched your children when you traveled to Paris and London. I ironed your husband's shirts when you were too busy. And for all of that, I received mockery disguised as gifts. She pointed to the broom, still wrapped in its cheap plastic, a monument to disrespect in her own kitchen. Patricia's composure cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I didn't marry you, Dorothy. I married Michael. And I don't owe you anything. Not gratitude, not respect, nothing. You chose to do those things. That's your problem, not mine. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking in its casual completeness, severing bonds that Dorothy had believed were unbreakable. That night, Dorothy lay awake staring at the ceiling, but not from pain, from clarity. For the first time in years, she saw her situation with perfect focus. She had been clinging to the hope that love could grow from habit, that if she gave enough, time, energy, silence, dignity, she would eventually be valued. But in Patricia's eyes, she was merely functional, a convenience to be tolerated when useful, and dismissed when inconvenient. The revelation was liberating in its honesty. What had everything suddenly shifted? Was it possible that Patricia's cruelty had inadvertently set her free? The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Dorothy's old friend Margaret called with news that seemed impossible. A distant cousin she barely remembered had passed away, leaving Dorothy a small inheritance. Not enormous, but enough to provide options she had never dared to consider. Sometimes God opens windows when people slam doors, Margaret said gently, and Dorothy felt something loosening in her chest, like the first breath after years of holding. As Dorothy hung up the phone, she walked to the wooden drawer beneath the old stove, where she kept Robert's love letters from their courtship. Beneath the faded envelopes lay a small velvet pouch, the box that had once held her wedding ring, now empty, but somehow more significant in its emptiness than it had ever been when full. She held it to the window, letting the morning light pass through its worn fabric, and made a decision that would honor both her past and her future. That afternoon, Dorothy called a real estate agent with a voice steadier than it had been in months. Yes, she said firmly, I'd like to sell the house. I want to start fresh somewhere new. The Victorian bungalow that had sheltered 3 generations of Murphys had become a prison of expectations and disappointments. It was time to transform those walls into possibility. When news of the sale reached her son Michael and Patricia, they arrived with expressions of forced concern that fooled no one. You're being impulsive, Mom, Michael said, though his worried eyes revealed more about lost financial security than maternal welfare. This house is our family's legacy. Think of the grandchildren. But Dorothy had already thought of them. How? They rarely visited how they knew more about video games than their grandmother's stories, how they had absorbed their parents' casual dismissal of her worth. Legacy requires love, Michael, Dorothy replied with calm certainty. You visit twice a year unless you need money. Patricia treats me like an inconvenience. Your children barely know my name. What legacy exists in a house filled with indifference? Her words hung in the air like a verdict, and Michael's sheepish expression revealed that he knew she was right, even if he couldn't admit it. Patricia's reaction was predictably explosive. So what, you're planning to die alone in some depressing senior center? Her fury masked the fear that Dorothy could see clearly now, the terror of losing a safety net that had always been taken for granted. No, Dorothy answered with the first genuine smile she had worn in months. I'm going to live with dignity. I'm moving to a lovely cottage by Lake Michigan where I can see the sunrise over the water every morning. I'll have neighbors who actually know my name and friends who remember my birthday. And when my time comes, I'll know I chose peace over pretense. Have you ever reached a moment in your life when you realized that walking away was the bravest thing you could do? Share your experience in the comments below. 2 months later, Dorothy received a phone call from her attorney that filled her with quiet satisfaction. Patricia had attempted to contest the property sale, claiming undue influence and questioning Dorothy's mental competency. But her lawyer had discovered something that left Patricia speechless. Dorothy had also changed her will completely, removing Patricia and Michael as beneficiaries and establishing a trust for elderly women seeking independence after lives of service to ungrateful families. When Patricia confronted her at the lake cottage, her fury was magnificent in its impotence. "You can't do this to us. I'm your daughter-in-law. Michael is your son. We have rights." But Dorothy, standing in her garden with soil under her fingernails and sunshine on her face, felt only profound peace. "You were my daughter-in-law," Dorothy said quietly, "until you threw that broom at my feet like I was your servant. That was the moment I realized I was nothing more than a convenience in your story. But in my story, I am finally the author." The truth settled between them like a bridge that could never be crossed again. As Patricia stormed away from the cottage, her expensive heels sinking into the soft earth of Dorothy's new garden, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the pure joy of living authentically. She had spent a lifetime giving, from obligation measuring her worth by others' approval, shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. That evening, as Lake Michigan whispered against the shore outside her window, Dorothy lit a candle and prepared a simple dinner. For one, the meal was perfect, not because it was elaborate, but because it was chosen, freely prepared with love for herself, and eaten in the company of someone who finally appreciated her worth. For the first time in years, she was truly home, not in a building, but in the understanding that dignity is not something others grant. It is something you reclaim. Because sometimes the greatest gift a woman can give herself is the courage to walk away from those who mistake her kindness for weakness, her service for obligation, and her love for guaranteed permanence. Dorothy had learned that lesson at 73, but it was not too late. It was exactly the right time. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel,